Hello, my name is Tom Bailey. I'm the lead English teacher at Northside High School in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I am going to address what I understand of trauma-informed care, what it means, and how it impacts my practice as an educator. So with that said, I'm going to preview some of the research that I've done with regard to this, but I found that trauma-informed care and understanding some of its concepts has been greatly beneficial to me as an educator. So before I begin, I'd like to preview my research. The first book that I am currently reading is called The New Executive Brain, Frontal Lobes in a Complex World by Goldberg from Oxford Press, 2009. It is about the ins and outs of how brains function and how they work and how they communicate and how perceptions and thoughts and things kind of come together or don't come together in the midst of all of this brain functioning, these neurons and all of those things like that. It is a good book, and I am only about halfway through it, but it reinforces an awful lot of what I've read in some of the other research. The next book that I'm going to, or the next source I'm going to talk about is Nadine Burke Harris's TED Talk called How Childhood Trauma Affects Health Across a Lifetime. She goes into great and explicit detail about how acute childhood experiences can have a long lasting and negative impact on the long-term health outcomes for people as well as education, but she focuses more from the health perspective. The next book is Eric Jensen's Teaching with Poverty in Mind. Much of what I cite here is available for free online at the website listed there. However, I've actually read the book in its entirety and in hard copy form, and it is a must read for anybody teaching in urban school districts or actually just thinking about going into teaching. Continuing with this discussion, then, there is a wonderful TED Talk, a TEDx talk by Vicki Kelly called The Paradox of Trauma-Informed Care. And she explains some of the underlying background to like post-traumatic stress disorder and how difficult that was to classify, et cetera. And then talking about how trauma-informed care and acute childhood experiences is kind of a current situation in psychology that is impacting education and other social services. I've also read Ruby Payne's A Framework for Understanding Poverty, the fourth revised edition. The school district for which I work provided some copies to some educators, and I made it a point to read it. Some of the concepts that she lays out in her book are still applicable today and actually align with the research on brain. But the most cited and directly cited source in this is the last one listed there. It's Four-letter in Forbes's The Trauma-Informed School, a step-by-step implementation guide for administrators and school personnel. And I'm going to be going into a lot of detail and using some of the diagrams that they've used in their book to bolster my underlying thesis here. So this is my research and the things that I have obviously read and am applying into the context of how I teach and what I do. So moving right along then, I would say that understanding acute childhood experiences and trauma-informed care comes down to understanding a tale of two brains. There's basically two brains that are out there among our students, and I've actually taught in two different settings in my lifetime. I've taught in a suburban setting, and I've also taught in an urban setting. And what I have found is that the brain to the left, the brain on acute childhood experiences and or poverty, is significantly different than the brain that has not experienced frequent acute childhood experiences and or poverty. But what exactly does this mean? So I'm going to further this discussion by talking about what acute childhood experiences actually are. There's basically two major categories of acute childhood experiences. One is childhood maltreatment and neglect. And then the other type is dysfunctional family environment. And there's a list, and this comes directly from pages 12 and 13 from Four-letter in Forbes. But also Nadine Burke Harris explicitly lists and discussed these in her TED Talk as well, which may include sexual, physical, or emotional abuse. One of the things that I thought was shocking then was also witnessing family violence. Obviously, that would have an acute childhood experience label to it because it's an emotionally stressful situation and difficult to negotiate feelings, et cetera, as that's happening. But I also noticed incarceration of a family member, having a mentally ill, depressed, or suicidal family member, or living with an addict or an alcoholic in the family. As somebody who comes from that background, I can certainly understand how that would fall under acute childhood experiences and how it would negatively impact thought processes, feelings of self-worth, of feelings of control, etc. But those are the lists and general categories of things that would count as acute childhood experiences from the research as it's currently been done. So moving on with the tale of two brains, what effects do acute childhood experiences have on the brain and on health? Well, this particular slide, I'm citing two pieces of information from Eric Jensen's Teaching with Poverty in Mind. The first one is he lays out toward the end of chapter 1 of his book, the direct effects of poverty. And what I'm going to kind of highlight here then is poverty basically makes it more likely that students who come from that background suffer more emotional and social challenges than, say, students that do not experience those things from middle class and upper middle class backgrounds. They are also more likely to be exposed to acute and chronic stressors. An acute stressor refers to something that happens as a one-time yet painful incident, like violence taking place or a death in the family, etc. Whereas then chronic refers to things that happen over and over again. As in, if a student is in poverty, they're in a constant state of stress because they're worried about, eating or having a safe place to live, sleep, etc. Jensen also points out that students who come from poverty usually suffer cognitive lags. And that actually matches quite well with some of the other brain research when we talk about trauma-informed care. Because if the brain is not in a state to process information in a calm, regulated tone or situation, the net result is that the opportunities and time to even learn academic content are compromised. And we'll discuss that later when we talk about the brain on poverty versus and acute childhood experiences versus the brain without it. The next thing is then they talk about health and safety issues are something that more frequently affect students who come from poverty backgrounds. And the chart to the right here illustrates this as far as the number of stressors versus between poor versus non-poor children. This came from Jensen's book on pages 7 and pages 23 respectively. And he gives more information. I highly recommend reading the book. So moving along to A Tale of Two Brains, what effects do ACEs have on the brain and on health? In Jensen's book, he establishes that basically the cumulative decline in test performance of students who come from a poverty income is similar to that of being exposed to pesticidal agents and other neurotoxic agents. In other words, poverty actually changes the brain chemistry to a point that the thought processes are compromised just as much as if the students and the children were actually on drugs. Furthermore, this chart to the right further illustrates adverse childhood experiences in the context of poverty, but also in discussing Nadine Burke Harris's How Childhood Trauma Affects Health Across a Lifetime. She goes on to state that there are explicit medical conditions that students who come from acute childhood experiences backgrounds are infinitely more likely to attain in adulthood. Things like depression, suicidal thoughts, actual suicides. She explicitly said that 15 to 20 years can be taken off your life expectancy just based upon exposure to acute childhood experiences. And there's a lot of research to support this, and she lays it out, but it was done by the Kaiser Foundation. Furthermore, then, so that comes back to, we talked about the research. Well, A Tale of Two Brains is that a brain on acute childhood experiences and or poverty experiences the world in what is known as a situation of bottom-up control. When information comes into the brainstem, the fact of the matter is that most of that information is processed in the midbrain and the reptilian brain, basically the sensory and the emotional cortexes, like those areas of the brain. And it is very rare and or sometimes impossible to get a student who is constantly in acute childhood experiences to use their neocortex, where logic, reasoning, and language are usually used to process information. Conversely, a student that has not experienced acute childhood experiences due to poverty usually processes from the top down, in other words, from the neocortex. And so even though they have fight or flight when dangerous things take place, The ability of a student who has not experienced a lot of childhood experiences allows them to bring that information to the front of the brain and to think logically about the consequences or what to do next, etc. So that is the difference between two different brains, one on acute child experiences and or poverty, and the other one that hasn't experienced those. A major question that has come up in educational circles is how is it that students in urban areas who are poor, how come they're more likely to experience lower test scores and to achieve less in school, et cetera, compared to their suburban and affluent counterparts? Well, the answer is pretty obvious here that a brain on acute childhood experiences, um, and those students are more likely to suffer those things, is chemically and physiologically different than the brain that has not experienced acute childhood experiences. And that's actually what is brought up in the TED Talk here is that with constant state of being in fight or flight, or the constant state of being exposed to chronic and acute stressors, um, Vicki Kelly points out that the fear and emotional centers of the brain are what eventually take control and hijack the functions that in most cases ought to be controlled by the front and top of the brain, i.e. the centers where logic and cogent reasoning takes place. The ability to pull oneself mentally out of a situation and to become metacognitive and then make a logical decision rather than an emotional decision. That is the feature that we need in students. And yet, because of acute childhood experiences and chronic stressors, our students have been hijacked by the lower part of the brain and experience bottom-up control rather than top-down. Okay, so then this leads us into how does trauma-informed care affect a classroom? How does it play out in a classroom? That said, normally students come into class and if they are dysregulated, they usually are dysregulated in two different ways. The first one is to be dysregulated with what is known as hyperarousal. Hyperarousal usually is the result of high levels of cortisol as well as high levels of adrenaline in the system. A lot of times, the students that are in this particular state are impulsive, aggressive, they tend to be loud, resistant to directives. There are some students that I almost have to give them a seat belt as part of their learning experience in the classroom because they're always up and about and need constant movement. A lot of times, the volume control is an issue. Perfect example of being hyper aroused is sometimes I've taught classes after lunch, and if something bad happened or something like a fight or something broke out at lunch, a lot of students will come in from the lunchroom actually like really amped up, wanting to talk about or adrenalized and entertained by the fight, so to speak. There's a class I currently teach now that many of the students have physical education the period before mine. And a lot of times they come in hyper arousal because they want to talk trash about the basketball game that they just played or how they did. And, oh, you saw me hooping, bro. And then, they talk like that. And I have to bring them down from this level of hyper arousal. That's why it's difficult, like, to get them to do what they need to do because they're so amped up and the adrenaline is flowing so much that you have to, give them some time. The other part then is the opposite of this spectrum known as hypoarousal. These are students that come in late, usually very depressed, withdrawn, showing little to no emotions or caring about things. These are students who are disproportionately absent from school or tardy to class an awful lot, um, tend to like feel overwhelmed. Sometimes you'll see them crying, etc. And that's because they've done the opposite reaction of the brain on acute childhood experiences, which is to, they talk about fight or flight. This level of dysregulation, hyper, is the fight, or literally to run, or the flight. And then hypo is the flight, as in to run away, as in to shut down and to give up. In both cases, this level of dysregulation makes it difficult for students to learn academic content in any sense. What we want students to be able to have is responsive, engaged, calm, and regulated behavior. You cannot teach students that are not regulated. If they're dysregulated as individuals, either hyper or hypo, academic learning is seriously compromised and unable to take place. Conversely, then, how you conduct your class, either with individuals who need to be regulated, or sometimes you need to regulate on the entire class and stop what you're doing before you can even get to that level of regulation for academic learning to take place. So these are the results of the brain on acute childhood experiences versus the brain that has not experienced these things. Continuing right along, then, so what does it mean for you as a teacher? There are implications for your teaching practice based upon this underlying brain chemistry, brain physiology, and the experiences the students have had. And I'm going to go through. I have written an article called Classroom Management, Commandments and Broken Windows, and these are outlined in more specific detail about how to set up a classroom environment to be safe and effective, especially for students that need trauma-informed care. The number one thing that I need to establish as a teacher every year is that my students believe my classroom is a safe environment for everyone. I want my classroom to be the place where they seek safety, where they know they will be safe. Number two, you also have to believe some things about yourself, and I'll go into more detail with that later. But one of the things that as a teacher you need to believe in yourself is that you have to have confidence to build relationships with students who have experienced things that are nothing like the experiences that you've had, or who do not look or have experienced different cultural backgrounds than you currently have. In other words, you need to value the diversity as well as the struggles that the students have. And you need to have the confidence in yourself to build relationships with students that maybe other adults are incapable of doing. Number four, you have to have rules in place, and we'll talk about that. You also have to practice things that you normally wouldn't have to practice in an affluent classroom or school setting, like practicing and planning rituals, practicing and planning times and ways to relax, regulate, breathing exercises, things of that nature. And I'll discuss that more in a minute. But number seven is one of the most important things, clarity and consistency. And one of the things that you have to be clear about is what your expectations are and that you will consistently adhere to them. Number eight, one of the concepts that you definitely have to think of is that accountability is a form of love. Unfortunately, for many of the students that I teach, their background and their family and their experiences do not lead to accountability or to things necessarily being normal. In fact, what is normal at home often conflicts with what is normal in the middle class or with school, etc. So, number nine, having a method to track what is going on. One of the problems that we face is that a lot of times teachers will be in a moment of conflict with a student, and then they will have forgotten that that moment even existed or how it transpired because they didn't record it. And when you don't record it or you forget it, it's very difficult to learn from it. And I'll discuss what that means later. Number 10, there are some things called the Students of Concern protocols and other methods. And those are some practices that can happen at the administrative level, but could also happen at the teacher and teacher team level. That are some practices that are highly effective that I've used in the past. Nonetheless, there's one fundamental truth that I still stand by, and it's in Rita Pearson's TED talk about being a child's champion. The students don't learn from the teachers they don't like. They have to like you first and be able to trust you enough that you'll be able to intervene and teach them the correct ways of doing it. So then that brings to like what this means to you as a teacher, your beliefs. You must be arrogant and confident enough that you are a powerful force in the lives of all of the young people that you come across in your classes, and even some that are not in your classes. Especially you see somebody in the hallway who's having a bad day or they just had a blow up, and you see yourself as an opportunity to listen and be responsive to them just as much as you would in the classroom. The second thing that you have to believe about yourself is that you are smart enough and caring enough to know if and when a student is dysregulated, and that you are willing to take the risk to help them become regulated. And most of the times that I've experienced this, I've been successful in helping a student become more regulated by using skill, tact, tone of voice, etc. There's been very few times where I felt like it blew up in my face, but ultimately it comes down to the willingness to try to care. Which brings us into the next part. You need to believe that you truly care about every single one of your students. not just the ones that do really well for you or do the best. You're looking out for 100% of your students, even the lost and forlorn, or even the ones that are openly combative with you for things that they don't even understand why they're combative. To add, you also have to believe that you cannot teach academic content to a student until you know they are in a state of regulation. If you're trying to just go into teaching because you love English or you love math and you love social studies, but you don't love people, you're not going to make it as a teacher. You have to have people skills and be able to evaluate the landscape of your classroom and individuals to know whether or not they're in a state of regulation and readiness to learn. And that brings us to the last part here. You have to believe that every single one of your students is worth the work. And the work is time consuming and it can be emotionally draining because you're making hundreds of decisions even within one class period of how you conduct business and how you relate to people. So this has repercussions then for what this means to you as a teacher when it comes to the rules of your classroom. Um, you need to have rules that establish and ensure that your class is physically, emotionally, and socially a safe place. Um, you can't have about a billion rules. You have to have just a handful that are easily applicable in many different situations. But that one in particular, I think, is most important above all, and it is this concept right here: respect. You need to ensure that respect is a norm that is practiced by all participants, and that disrespect will be handled by the adult, not the student. And to kind of build upon this, um, there is a tendency, especially among students who've experienced acute childhood experiences, as well as students from poverty, that when they are disrespected socially, their knee jerk reaction is that they can't be punked, that you're not going to say that to them without saying something back. In other words, in their brains, they have gone to fight or flight and already believe that two wrongs make a right. And in your classroom, that is not okay. And that is one part of like culture outside of the classroom not being acceptable in the classroom. And that is why you have to establish the protocols and procedures that when a student is disrespectful, it is not another student's responsibility to respond to that disrespect. And that also means that as a teacher, you yourself should not ever speak disrespectfully or meanfully at a student. And if you do, you will have to respectfully apologize and rebuild that relationship because you are indeed the adult. So that is one of the biggest things that teachers must do for trauma informed care is establish norms and protocols for how disrespect is and is not handled in a given classroom. And you're going to have to teach and exhibit and maybe even do role playing to make that the case so that people understand the situation. That brings up another thing about rules is rules need to establish consistent boundaries of when, how, and methods through which daily business goes on. How to get attention of the teacher, how to go and grab a computer from uh, the computer lab if you're using one. You have to have rules that say that this is what will happen as a result of this. One of the rules that I've established is that if I ask you to the hallway, I expect my students to go, and then I will explain why they were out there once we get out. But that last one, then, enforce policies and norms of the school as a whole, consistency. If if the school has a policy about a certain thing, it is the teacher's obligation to make sure that that policy is consistently implemented, regardless of which class you're in or which class that you happen to be in charge of. A case in point here was I've had a colleague who's no longer with us, but she routinely let students get on their cell phones, even though it explicitly went against the policies of the school. And the policy was put in good in place for very, very good and logic and research based reasons. But because that one teacher consistently broke that norm, those students are developmentally behind an entire academic year in language arts. And that's the consequences of not being consistent. So if there is a school policy about this thing taking place, et cetera, then you're obligated as a teacher to make sure that you are consistent with your rules. You have to remember, many of the students come from homes where there aren't any boundaries. And in fact, the students oftentimes, because now, especially in high school, they're big enough and strong enough to make their own boundaries and tell the adults exactly what they're going to do. But they might be able to do that out there. But in our school, a school of support, trauma informed, and love, we don't accept that. We have boundaries and norms that are part of being a civilized human being. And what we're learning too with brain research is that if we practice those things in physical sense, they become cognitive in a sense as well. Which brings me then to rituals. You cannot assume that students know where to be and when they should be there. You should never assume that. Some educators that have been flushed out go, if I just treat students like adults, they'll act like adults. That's absolutely the most false syllogism in the history of mankind. In fact, if you treat them like adults with the freedoms of adults, they will run buck wild all over you. And that is why you, as a trauma informed teacher, have to establish the rituals and norms that give students clarity on where they're supposed to be and what they should be doing. So rituals where students are clearly shown when they enter the classroom what is expected of them, when and where they sit down. And yes, seating charts have a positive impact on student engagement and consistency. Establish norms about when adults are speaking. In fact, one of my rules is when adults are speaking, you should not be speaking. When they are getting up to move around for activities, how do they do that? When they are getting up to get and to use technology in responsible ways, you have to teach them and have them practice doing that. You can't just go, hey, I just opened the computer lab, now you run over there and grab it, because they'll literally do that because they have not been taught how to do things in a logical and cogent fashion. Also, then, you have to have rituals that allow for disruptions or transitions between learning experiences. In my class, I use if you hear my voice clap twice that interrupt loud situations, because in my class, I expect students to collaborate. I expect students to be working sometimes on loud and a multimedia project. Same thing as three claps. I clap three times and then they clap back three times. I also think that it is a good practice, regardless of content area, to do breathing, relaxation, and movement rituals that are not even like you could do yoga and stuff in your class. But by practicing these on a regular basis, you will have techniques and physical methods through which you can bring students back to the top and front of the brain. And then, of course, celebratory and bucket filling rituals. Take opportunities in your class to praise and be thankful for what students have done for you and what they have done for each other. Make it a point to do what is known as bucket filling, which is there's a basic book about it called "Have You Filled Someone's Bucket Today?" And it's about the growing research on happiness and how happiness is actually truly established. That could probably be its own podcast in the future. Nonetheless, what this means for you as a teacher in the context of trauma informed is that you should be part of what is known as the help for Billy sequence. On page 171, and there's another page in the book, they outline this process with this particular diagram. Basically, Billy is a metaphor, is just a generic name for somebody. It can be a female for that matter, who is dysregulated because of the things that have happened in their life, the acute childhood experiences, poverty, etc. The only way that you can get a Billy regulated is through exhibiting these values, listening, connecting with them, empathizing with them, accepting what they have to say, tolerating them, validating their opinions, and showing them love before they can get back into the regulated state, which will then allow them to rationalize, problem solve, and be at the basically we could say coming back to the front of the brain. So when you are conducting class, this theme is kind of playing out that the decisions you make, the relationships you establish, and the methods of intervention for students should somehow align with that help for Billy sequence. You got to know your cues, your tone, how you approach situations, either individually or to entire class periods. That is the essence and the art of helping students who are dysregulated, and really is the foundation of being a highly effective teacher in a trauma-informed school. I also think this next part that I'm circling here, oftentimes when I've coached and observed teachers, Many teachers are not mindful or understand that they themselves have turned into dysregulated teachers. And it is oftentimes because when a student misbehaves, we tend to take things personally. We get angry or whatever. And the net result is that we don't make good decisions when we ourselves are dysregulated. So if you can imagine, if the adult is dysregulated in a classroom, what's going to happen to the students who are dysregulated in that classroom? So that is something too, upon reflection as a teacher, you should always be mindful of where you are and your own different levels of safety, regulation versus dysregulation. Additionally, teaching students mindfulness and relaxation techniques has been proven to improve academic engagement and productivity. And that's because it goes back to the slide I showed before. Those things take students back to a state of regulation, takes them back to the higher part of the brain. Another practice that I believe all teachers should engage in is the use of reflection and data. Um, in the last 2 years, I haven't written a single referral as a teacher, and I've had very difficult and very challenging students that cussed at me or cussed and called me names, etc., in ways that they shouldn't have. But what ended up happening is me and I worked with a co-teacher because I taught integrated services the entire day. We used a method where we each had a website saved, and basically every time something would happen, either positive, negative, or something just weird happened that stood out to us as something worthy of note, we would record the class period. We would record the student's last name, comma, first name. And then we would also then classify, was it positive, was it negative, or are we just taking notes? Is it anecdotal just to tell the story anyway? And then we would type what happened. And what we found was, as we're gathering this type of anecdotal data in the course of August and into September, by the middle of September, we could see trends in the types of maladaptive behaviors that students were doing, or the disruptive behaviors they were doing, or the kinds of weird and strange things that they were saying or doing. And as a result of that, we were able to make very good conclusions and judgment calls about what we should do in the classroom, whether it was the action step of moving their seat, or the action step of separating this person from this person, or being aware that if the buses are late, we can almost anticipate with 80% certainty that this student is going to be dysregulated when they walk into the classroom. And it has helped prevent so many things. It helped prevent fights. It prevented conflict between students and adults, not necessarily us. It helped prevent conflicts between students. It definitely is one of the number one contributing factors about why I haven't had to write a referral in more than one school year. But what this also means for you as a teacher is that it is your obligation to, as a teacher and as a learner, understand that teaching and learning is connected with your ability to help students reclaim their executive functions of the brain. We want top-down control with our students. We want them using their neurocortex. We want them to understand that there's a minute after this one and a day and an hour after this one, that the actions right now that they take will have consequences later, rather than just operating in the lower sensory and emotional centers of the brain. In order to also establish top-down control of the brain, teachers must build relationships of support, trust, and compassion. No student will listen to any of my techniques unless they trust me enough and I've built a good enough relationship that they'll believe what I'm asking them to do, and then they'll actually try it. That also means, too, that we have to teach students coping techniques, whether it's to take an extra breath here, or, let's take 5 minutes to put our heads down and relax before we move on to the next thing. As a teacher, too, we have to be aware and help move students from states of dysregulation, either hyper aroused or hypo aroused, toward the state of regulation so that they can be focused, calm, and task oriented. The other thing then that will happen is that if you can do this effectively, students will change how they process and perceive information. I've experienced where I've said something innocuous, or like, "Hey, how's your day going? What can I do for you?" And the student was like, went off on me. And what I realized is that even though I had said something positive and innocuous, like didn't mean anything, because the student was operating in that fight or flight part of the brain, it didn't matter what I was going to say to that student. I was an adult in a perceived threat. I was a perceived power structure. And the net result is that they processed things completely incorrect versus what was happening in reality. Over time, what you'll see is that students will be able to reclaim their sense of control over their emotions and the decisions that they're making. Because really, we want the processing to move from the sensory and emotional centers of the brain to the front and to the neocortex and to the logical. And that is the basis for any academic and linguistic learning, as well as logical learning. So my conclusion then is, I hope this was informative, but in a very deeper context, I believe understanding trauma-informed care, and actually Vicki Kelly mentioned this in her TED Talk, that it took a long time for the American Psychological Association to actually acknowledge the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, when adults had experienced things in war or traumatic events and then suffered after the fact. As of right now, there's a discussion about childhood experiences and acute childhood experiences and having a disorder with that. And it's going to take almost an idea that teaching and learning and what we do for these young people is a moral imperative for our society. Unfortunately, most of the politicians and the leadership of the country in the last 20 years have basically asserted the false syllogism that, oh, those kids, those poor kids, if those teachers would just teach better, those poor students would learn. And it was a completely superficial and false syllogism, basically designed to humiliate teachers and actually to take away resources from the people who actually need them the most, which are schools that help and serve the communities that need the most help. I believe it is our next moral imperative as a society to acknowledge that this is what is really the difference between those who learn and those who don't, those who consume and those who create. Um, I believe then that leaders right now and policymakers should heed these findings to enact policies that empower those at the front lines of this epidemic to take on the challenge. And this also includes healthcare and social services, because we are paying for this not just with how we fund schools, we're paying for it with how we fund prisons. We're paying for this by how we pay for Medicare, et cetera. We're paying for this in health outcomes that cause chronic disorders like heart disease or need invasive surgeries and things like that. We're paying for this in lost productivity and hours because those things hurt people's ability to get to work and to do what they need to do. So call me crazy, but I absolutely believe that trauma-informed care is the very beginning of teacher practice, but also societal focus and a shift toward the fact that we have to know that education is definitely worth the investment, and then it will pay off in billions and billions of dollars of productivity and better health outcomes, and overall a better quality and sense of life that our students and our future of this country rightfully deserve. Thank you.